third and final part of this tutorial series on the challenges to traditional power and authority in Japan from 1921 to 1929. If you haven't watched the first two tutorials on the political pressures that the Taisho democracy faced and the economic climate of the period, then I recommend that you go back and watch that before continuing to watch onto this third part of the tutorial. Just to remind you of our key focus question for this series is, to what extent did the Taisho democracy effectively manage the pressures of the 1920s? We know that this is a very turbulent period in which the Taisho is really struggling to retain the democratic ideals of the government that it seeks to establish. And these political parties, the Miseito and the Seiyukai, are really struggling to have a firm grip on the democratic process because they're constantly being kind of torn at, and each group is trying to carve out a part of political power for themselves. Those groups that are seeking to do this, as covered in the first tutorial, we looked at political parties and the constitution. Then in the second tutorial, we focused on the economic climate and the Zaibatsu. And in this tutorial, we're going to focus on these oligarchs. This is a group of people who are really trying to seek out more authoritarian style government and, in addition, trying to expand their own power base. So we'll first start off, with the military. So after World War One, and there's a real peak of military spending during this period of time, they now go back and they start to cut away the military spending. This is going to be a kind of reoccurring issue for the military. Obviously, no military commander is going to like having their budget cut. And so this is going to be more and more problematic as we go forward, because the military believe that they should be, at the spear tip of Japanese society. Despite this, they cut, lots of troops, but this is redistributed to modernizing weaponry. They also have military education in middle and high school. So we see this movement towards a militaristic style of education in Japan. And that's kind of very, tied into this kotutai, this national essence. And they believe that this is a really kind of vision for what Japan should be. In addition, the Kwantung army, grew increasingly frustrated by these budget cuts and decline of their military, prestige. So we're going to focus on who that Kwantung army is. These are very ultra-nationalistic form of independent kind of military group. They are formed in 1919 after the end of World War One, and they're based in Port Arthur. This is the port that they secure control over, during the Russo-Japanese War, and then further, in World War One. And so they have control. You can see there, Dalan. This is also the other name for Port Arthur. And so they believe that the democratic government in Japan could not kind of achieve, this kind of new wave of imperialism. They couldn't achieve, the vision that they had set out to do. And so they weren't fit to rule, and they would, if necessary, take action to remove them violently if necessary. They also fear the influence of Chinese communism in Manchuria. During the 1920s and 1930s, China is kind of divided into two kind of main groups. There are other warlords who are seeking to establish their own power, but the two of them are the Chinese communists led by Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, who is the leader of the Nationals, or the Kuomintang. They are kind of fighting for reunification of China, and they obviously have competing ideals about how that should be done. Due to the influence of the Zaibatsu, this becomes a real attack, and the military, which is really formed from the rural, peasant class of Japan, are really, pro, peasant and worker rights. There's a real kind of distinction between the superiors in the army itself and the everyday soldier, who was drawn from the peasant classes. So there's a real distinction between these two groups, and so they really attacked the Zaibatsu for driving people into poverty. The Kwantung Army gets into a number of kind of skirmishes and clashes with Chinese troops. And so the division commander moved troops from Tsingtao to Jinan because they feel threatened by the kind of advancing KMT army. And so just the proximity of troops doing nothing in Jinan leads to an incident. There is, some small fire, a couple of people are tragically killed, and then the issue is that attempts at settlement kind of fail, and so the Kwantung Army view this as a matter of national honor. And so what they do is they start to impose and occupy Jinan, and they impose martial law until 1929. So this kind of shows to you how they believe their kind of right is in China. They believe that every kind of battle is a test of this Japanese spirit, and so they seek to protect it as much as possible. In class, we'll look at the imperial script to soldiers and to sailors, and this really kind of clarifies what this Kotutai spirit is. Another issue they get into is they seek out to assassinate a warlord called Zhang Zhulin. And so I mentioned before that they viewed China as this problem, and they believe that they had a Manchuria-Mongolia problem. Zhang Zhulin, previously collaborated with the Japanese. It is thought that he was taking steps to align himself with the emerging Kuomintang, this nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek. And so the commander of the Kwantung Army orders for the train carrying Jolin to be blown up and destroyed. You can see an image here of the wreckage that is caused. Despite this, his son and heir commits to the Kuomintang government. This is one of these warlords who have this kind of hereditary control over part of northern China. And so this kind of further intensify the issue that we see more and more people joining the nationalist cause. The attempt to kind of force PM Tanaka Gichi to use military force to protect Japanese interests in China, he did not want to take this kind of radical step. And because of his kind of weak handling of the incident involving Zhang Zhulin, he is removed as prime minister by Emperor Hirohito. So remember, Hirohito is going to come to power in 1926, the new Showa emperor. And so this, I just want you to draw this attention to it because we're going to be looking at Hirohito's influence as we go through the course. Take note of this because, Hirohito is a character which sometimes is not always at the forefront, but is always kind of behind the scenes, kind of moving things around. And so he does have a huge amount of influence in the period. So just keep note of this when we get back to later in the course as well. The genro, so we looked at them in their survey. So if you haven't got a good understanding of the Meiji Constitution, you need to go back and review that first and foremost, But remember, as a part of the Meiji Constitution, there's this group of elder statesmen, there's 6 of them, the genro, who choose the prime minister. In addition to that, there's also another group of oligarchs called the Privy Council. They have a huge amount of control over things like foreign policy. They have a connection with the emperor. And so any group of people that has a connection with the emperor kind of has, political control. The Seiyukai administration, was really focused on implementing social welfare programs to address issues such as unemployment, labor disputes, tenant and farmer protests. They also push a health insurance law and revised factory laws to the Diet in 1922. But because of the budgetary control that the Privy Council has over the Diet, they oppose and they refuse to allocate funds to implement the laws. And so, these basic kind of necessities about health insurance and workers' rights and factories are not passed. So we see, again, the oligarchs really, focusing on making sure that they would protect their own power. A lot of these are wealthy landowners, wealthy industrialists. And so at this time, they really want to cling on to the power that they've been able to carve out for themselves. The genro, who was led by Prince Seioji, undermined the democratic process by appointing PMs. who are not the head of the major political party. Okay, so this is a really important point, because what we get is prime ministers who are drawn from the other party. And so constantly the political system is constantly kind of undermined by this process. So even though the Seiyukai, wins the majority, a Masato prime minister is elected. And so we get a system that is breaking down, okay? And the prime minister has a huge amount of control. Apologies. And so we don't get a system that really functions seamlessly. It's only twice, okay, that we see the largest party, a prime minister being chosen from them. The first one, okay, is one of the most stable governments of this period, okay, the government under Harakei in 1918, and then later on with Kaito Tahiki in 1924. So because of this, the appointed PM then calls a new election to obviously win his party control over the Diet, and then his party won majority control in the House of Reps. And so this process, it constantly means that people are going back to elections time and time and time again. The appointed PM, okay, was very much helped by the control of the Home Ministry. Okay, this is a really important group, because this, again, is evidence of this idea of moving towards more authoritarian style control. They ran police, they supervised elections, and so we can best summarize the political kind of climate at this time is that voters confirmed changes in the government, but these changes were really driven by the genro. They choose the prime minister, and therefore the prime minister calls for a new election. When the election happens, okay, the party that is the prime minister is put then into power, and so the voters have really a secondary kind of impact. They're not necessarily bringing about who they would want as the prime minister or who they would want as the leading group over the Diet. And so this is this idea that we get of the Taisho democracy being a very limited style democracy. And so, it can be best kind of described here by Gordon. I'm going to leave you with this quote. So the parliamentary government in pre-war Japan was just constrained by formal and informal institutions. So things like the formal, we can talk about the genro, okay, the Meiji Constitution. Okay, and informally, we can talk about things like the zaibatsu. We can focus on things like, the military. That's probably more formal, I would say. But you think about the new ideas and these labor organizations that are starting to come into power as well. It faced ideological challenge and organized attacks from emperor-centered radicals on the right and a wide range of activists on the left. By the late 1920s, it commanded only tepid support from natural allies such as the press and many intellectuals. And so, if you have not got the support of the majority of society, and most especially with a government, if you haven't got the support of the army, it is very, very difficult for you to stay in power. And so you can see that this system, because of each group trying to attack it from left and from right, trying to carve off bits of their own, kind of power, the fiber of the Taisho democracy is going to start to capitulate. And that is what's going to happen in the 1930s. And so our next tutorial, we're really going to focus on the key change that happens in the late 1920s, which is the Great Depression, and then go on to have a look about how that leads to the collapse of the parliamentary system of government